I'd like to start by acknowledging the Indigenous owners of the land on which we're meeting today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and to pay my respects to elders past and present and future from that nation. Today's lecture, as you probably already know, is about Australia's immigration history. It's a very rich topic because in its modern form, Australia is a nation that exists because of immigration. And we could really argue that all of Australian history is in fact about immigration. I'm going to break it down into 7 key stages of immigration. So we're not talking this, and this is beginning with what's considered Australia's modern immigration period, so not when the Aboriginal people first came here. So the modern period of immigration began with invasion by the British, with white settlement and convicts, which is the period from 1788 to 1850. And then we had the gold rushes, and I'll explain more about all of these stages as we go. So the gold rushes took place from 1850 to 1860. Following that period, we had a period of emerging racism and restriction on immigration, which led up to the 4th period, which was called the White Australia period in Australian history. That lasted up until the end of past the end of the Second World War, and then we had the period of post-war reconstruction until 1970. And then moving into the more recent history of Australia, we've got multicultural Australia, and then more recently again, what Sarah has called here border disorders. So we'll see if we can get through most of this today. Okay, so it's important to remember that people do and have moved around the globe for many centuries, and indeed for tens of thousands of years. Movement of people has been a part of human life, and from the first movement out of Africa onwards, we have seen different patterns and reasons for movement around the world. So we know that people first spread throughout Africa about 150,000 years ago. They occupied the Levant, or the part with the green arrows, by about 100,000 years ago. Sorry, that's the yellow arrow there, the Levant, by about 100,000 years ago. The next big wave of migration led to people coming to Australia and East Asia about 50,000 years ago. And then 10,000 years after that, people moved into Europe and Siberia. So we know that people moving into the country we now call Australia began over 40 to 50,000 years ago, when Aboriginal Australians first began to arrive here in search of resources and food. Okay, so if we're going back again to this is very similar to the map that we saw last week in the lecture on Aboriginal Australia. And we can see that actually Australia has always been a multicultural place. There's always been, because the Aboriginal people are not just one culture, they're many, many different cultures. And this is probably the most commonly accepted map of where different Aboriginal nations are located in Australia. Okay, so before Europeans, or before the British first came to Australia in 1770, there was actually trade between North Australian Aboriginal peoples and people from Southeast Asia as well. So we could actually begin our modern migration history with Asian immigration. However, we don't have any really. This is not the kind of the myth, I guess, the founding myth that Australia is built upon, which is that Australia was discovered by Captain James Cook, and that's a picture of him there. So this is what you might think of as our traditional founding narrative of Australian history, is that settlement or invasion of Australia occurred after Captain Cook had claimed the area in 1770. And this was during a period of movement related to the growth of European empires, and a time when there was a lot of international trade, a lot of trade and a lot of labour needed for that industry. So, and for example, when I was growing up, when we learned Australian history at school, we always started with Captain Cook. It was always, 50 years ago, we kind of pretended that nothing really happened before 1770, which is just over 200 years ago. But of course, we know that there was a lot of rich Aboriginal history and things going on in Australia before that. Okay, so Captain Cook, what's that? It's okay. So Captain Cook, he arrived here, but he didn't stay here. He left again. So the first actual settlement, or now many people prefer to call it an invasion of Australia, happened with the First Fleet. That was 11 ships that left England in May 1787. The journey took 252 days and was 15,900 miles long. There were 22 babies born during the voyage. 69 people died during that voyage, and it was led by Captain Arthur Phillip. And there were approximately 1,500 men, women and children on the boats that set sail there. And almost many of the people who were on these boats were convicts. So convicts were people who were prisoners who'd been found guilty of crimes in England, and they were sent to Australia as a punishment for their crimes. And one thing we know is some of these crimes were serious, but some of them were very minor, things like just stealing a loaf of bread or food because people were hungry. There were also, even though almost all of the people who came were from Britain and Ireland, there were two other groups of people that we know a lot less about. There were a group of Jewish convicts on the First Fleet. These were people from Eastern Europe. At that period, London was home to many Jewish people who, for various reasons, were living in poverty. So it's not surprising that many of them actually ended up stealing food in order to feed their families, and that led some of them to be sent to Australia as punishment. There were also some convicts of African origin, and these are just two quite famous, or two that we know a little bit more about, I guess. The one in the picture is John Black Caesar, who was born in Madagascar in the West Indies, and on the 17th of March he was found guilty for stealing 240 shillings, and he was sent to Australia for his crime. Okay, so from 1788 to 1868, Britain transported 160,000 convicts from overcrowded prisons in 800 ships. And this was really the basis at the beginning of the first modern migration to Australia. So Australian, that we know today, was really founded by convicts or prisoners. When they arrived here, they were outnumbered by at least 500,000 Indigenous people whose ancestors had lived here for 50,000 years, the Aboriginal people. So convict transportation went on for about 60 to 80 years. It stopped in the state of New South Wales in 1840, but it didn't stop in Western Australia, for example, until 1868. So that's only, about 150 years ago. So convicts who worked hard and stayed out of trouble got what was called a ticket of leave before the completion of their sentences. And they could then work and buy property, but they had to live within a specified district and report to the local magistrate or judge. The governor could also grant a pardon to some convicts who would then become completely free people or free settlers. And they were given a certificate of freedom at that point, or for the rest of them, once they had served out their sentence, they were given a certificate of freedom and could live on the land as free people. And then one of the major things that really shaped Australia's modern history was the discovery of gold in the 1850s. So everything really started to change about then. Before that, almost half of the people who came to Australia were still convicts, but after 1850, with the discovery of gold, we move into the second period of Australian migration. Gold really did change everything for Australia, and particularly for this city, Melbourne. As news spread around the world, thousands of people rushed to the Australian goldfields, raising Victoria's population from 80,000 in 1851 to 540,000 in 1861. So someone who's good at maths can tell me how many times that is over a period of just 10 years. That's a lot. 7? Thanks. Yeah. Many people made money, and it did a lot to develop the wealth of this city and Australia as a whole. So over half of the immigrants who came because of the gold were again from Britain, but at this time there were also large numbers of Europeans. So we saw many Germans, French, Swiss and Italians, for example. There were many Americans came, and also, and perhaps most significantly, about 40,000 Chinese migrants came during the gold rush. And this was the first really big influx of migrants from Asia that we saw in Australia. And that's a picture of people working on the goldfields, and the quote there is from somebody who was writing at the time describing all the different people who are now living in Australia. This influx of people from China really did change I guess, Australia's population significantly. In this painting here, the one at the top, which was done in 1856, you can see a procession of Chinese people leaving Flemington. So Flemington is a suburb just next to where we are now, just to our north, and they left Flemington and walked all the way to the goldfields, which are near Bendigo and Ballarat. So that would be about 100 kilometres away, a long walk. Most of them came to try to find gold and then intended to go home again after that. It's important to get a sense of why people leave their homeland when studying migration, to understand what we call push factors as well as pull factors that motivate people to leave. So during the 19th century, there were conditions in China meant that there were really good reasons for people to leave, especially in the southern provinces, which were overpopulated and had been attacked by the British and also experienced rebellion, floods and famines during that time. So, for example, at that time you had Britain was trying to continue its opium trade with China, and you had the first Opium War in 1840. Hong Kong was given by China to Britain in 1842. You had the Taiping Rebellion, which involved around a third of China falling under the control of a Christian religious movement. And the death toll during all these years of war was about 20 million people. So yeah, good reasons for people to want to leave China at that time. We also saw the beginning of sort of really overt or open racism in Australia towards the Chinese, because up until then, sort of non-Aboriginal Australia was mainly British, with a few other white Europeans. There was considerable resentment towards the Chinese at this time, and this is a picture of one anti-Chinese riot that happened called the Lambing Flat Riots in 1860 to 61. So the main result of this was not punishment of the violent white miners, but rather the colonial governments passed anti-Chinese immigration restrictions, which included a £10 entry tax on all Chinese coming into Victoria, which was an enormous amount of money at the time. It would be the same as about $10,000 today. And you can see here that the white miners called the Chinese moon-faced barbarians at that time. And these were some of the anti-Chinese posters that were published at the time too. So some of this sort of reaction, I guess, to the Chinese coming was the beginning of Australia starting to define itself, or trying to define itself as a white man's land, as you can see from this poster. And this became really important later on, where we had the beginning of actual government policies which restricted migration to white people. However, even though we saw this racism and resentment, when required, non-white workers were brought in throughout the 19th century. So we saw servants from India coming from the 1830s until the 1880s. We also had a large group of people from the Middle East who were all called Afghans, so they probably were not all Afghans. Certainly some of them would have been from Afghanistan. And the people who came at that time helped to open up the trade routes across Australia. They rode camels into the interior to facilitate or help with the building of railways. Most of these pioneers were male, and they often married Aboriginal women. And that picture at the top is a picture of an old Afghan mosque in South Australia. It doesn't look much like a modern mosque. And one thing you might or might know, there's a train that goes from South Australia up into the centre of Australia, up to Alice Springs, and it's called the Ghan, and it was because it was named after the Afghan people who opened up those routes. At that time, we also saw a lot of people coming from the Pacific Islands, and they came mostly to Queensland and worked in the sugarcane and cotton fields at that time. These people were called Kanakas, and it's estimated that over 60,000 people from the Pacific Islands came at that time. And many of them were forcibly recruited or kidnapped by agents of the Queensland colonial government and brought to Australia to work in the fields in terrible conditions. So they were essentially equivalent to slaves, even though we don't actually have an official history of slavery in Australia. There's a lot of similarities. Even though we had all these different people coming to Australia, still most of the migrants came from Britain and Ireland. So at the end of the 19th century, in 1901, we saw that out of 3.7 million, most were actually born in Australia. 77% of the people here had been born here by that point. 22% had come from other countries, and of those, 60% of those had come from the United Kingdom, with another 20% from Ireland. And then that chart shows you some of the other places that made up significant numbers. Okay, so this brings us to a really important point, or federation. So federation was when the 6 independent colonies, so what are now the states of Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia, what have I forgotten, Tasmania, if people always forget Tasmania. They all came together to form one country. So until then, they were all completely independent. And this period is called, this time is called Federation, and that happened in 1901. Federal policies were developed in the context of continued ties to the British Empire. It followed the economic depression of the 1890s, and it was really a time of new nationalistic feelings or ideas about Australia. And one of the other key things that was going on was fears of Asian of hordes of people, or millions of people migrating to Australia from Asia. So it was about wanting to develop this sort of Australia that was linked to Britain at the time. As I said, there was a lot of fears of Chinese migration in particular to Australia, and these were some of the racist cartoons that were around at the time. So that first one says, in 3 years, Australia destroyed, and shows these sort of pictures of invading Chinese people. And then the second one was called the Mongolian octopus. And you can see on the tentacles of the octopus, you've got, words like immorality, opium, robbery. So there was all these racist ideas about what this type of migration would bring to Australia, which is quite interesting considering it was a country founded by prisoners who were all here because they committed crimes in the first place. Okay, so after Federation, the new Parliament passed what was called the Immigration Restriction Act. And this developed what became known later as the White Australia Policy. So there was never a piece of actual paper that said White Australia Policy across the top. Rather, the Immigration Restriction Act, which was one of the very first acts of the new national government, was the document that set up White Australia and set down laws about who could and who couldn't enter the country. And while it didn't mention race specifically, the rules it laid down virtually eliminated all non-European immigration. And one of the ways they did that was they had what was called a dictation test, where people who arrived in Australia, this happened a bit later, not right from the beginning, immigration officials would give them a test, and they would have to write out in whatever language the immigration official chose a piece of dictation. And if they failed it, they could be sent away. And this was used to exclude people that Australia didn't want here. So these ideas weren't particularly unusual amongst white settler nations around the world at the time. Both the United States and New Zealand had a version of this policy as well. And these were all set up largely on the basis of shared ideas about racial hierarchy, ideas that white people were at the top of the ladder of races around the world, and that fed into particular ideas about nationalism and the nation around the turn of the century. And so these are some of the sort of well-known Australians who, some of whom were actually based at this university, who are now sort of thought of as being extremely racist, but at the time were seen as real leaders of the nation. So you had the top person who was the Prime Minister, who introduced the Immigration Restriction Act. Professor Charles Pearson, the second person in that picture, was at Melbourne University, who predicted that what he called the higher races of men would soon find themselves thrust aside by servile races, by which he meant people from China. And then what became a very famous phrase was coined by Alfred Deakin, who was another Prime Minister, who warned about the yellow peril to Caucasian civilization, and he was talking about the Chinese people who would overrun Australia, in his view. Okay, and these are all just brochures that were around at the time. This was one that, called Keep Australia White, and one of the things that people tried to do at this time was increase migration from Europe and from the United Kingdom, or from Great Britain in particular, because it was seen that Australia they felt was an empty land, and that was tempting for other people to come here, and so the desire was to fill it up with white people from the United Kingdom. And we can see here in this brochure it says, "In the interests of defence and the maintenance of a white Australia, can we afford to wait 62 years to reach 20 million, which is the barest margin of safety?" So it's felt that we needed 20 million people here if we weren't going to be a temptation for other people to invade. So there, that picture just shows Australia was seen as a magnet for people who wanted to come here because it was so empty. And this, another poster, millions of people wanted to fill up Australia's empty spaces, but we were very particular about which people we wanted in particular. So as well as the yellow peril, we had Italians were seen as the olive peril. So in 1920s, this use of coloured labels for Italians was widespread, as well as racist labels, images and songs. And that's one of the songs there on that slide. So these riots happened again at this period in 1934, so not that, I guess, during the Depression. The Great Global Depression, we saw riots in Western Australia against Italians, Slavs and other foreigners. And this is a picture of an Italian family sitting outside their burnt-out home after one of these riots in Kalgoorlie. That was during the Depression. So during the economic depression of the late 1920s and 1930s, immigration was restricted with many, so even though we had this great push to bring lots of people out, many people feared that migrants who came at this time would just add to the great numbers of unemployed people. And so that's one of the reasons why we saw immigrants who were arriving from Southern Europe, so Greece and Italy in particular, were targeted at this time. We actually saw that the proportion of overseas-born people dropped. So by 1947, at the end of the Second World War, only just under 10% of people in Australia, out of a total of 7 million, were born in countries other than Australia. And again, almost the great majority of them were from the United Kingdom and Ireland, with also quite a large number from New Zealand, and then smaller numbers from Germany, Italy and Greece. At the end of the Second World War, however, again, as sort of Australia's politicians turned to migration to try to bring more people out. So it was seen that we needed to stimulate the economy by increasing the population at that time. As it mentioned on the previous slide, there was only about 7.5 million people living in Australia at the end of the Second World War. So then Prime Minister Ben Chifley, that's him with the pipe, established the post-war immigration scheme and ways for people migrating to become Australian citizens. We had improvements in social services at that time. We had much investment in public housing, expansion of university education, and also the founding of ASIO, which is Australia's spy agency. More people were seen as the answer to Australia's, I guess, economic problems at that time. That was when the Department of Immigration was established under Minister Arthur Calwell. That's a picture of him there. I think he's like to have his photo taken with migrant children. So politicians haven't changed that much. And that Arthur Calwell, actually, as Prime Minister, worked really hard to convince Australians of the need for greatly increased immigration after the war. And these are some of the posters that were produced to show how Australia's population had declined because people were having fewer children, and that was why we needed to bring out more migrants. But there was still a great emphasis on British immigration as being seen as the most desirable. So there was a campaign called Bring Out a Britain, and it was and this is a clear policy of the Immigration Department up until the 1970s. And they devised different schemes and promoted cheap fares and gave assistance to attract migrants from Britain. So over 1.5 million came in the post-war decades, but they didn't come to Australia in the numbers that the government wanted. They wanted more than that. And in fact, at that time we had, you can see in that poster there, it says £10 can take you to Australia. So there's this expression called a £10 POM, which is someone who came from Britain to Australia for just £10, and the government paid the rest of the cost. So of course, at the end of the Second World War, we know there were millions of displaced people in Europe. So while Australia was trying to bring out Britain, there were actually hundreds of thousands of people who had been displaced by the war from other European countries. And so these people became another important component of our migration history at that time. In 1947, Australia signed an agreement with the International Refugee Organisation to take 12,000 people a year from war-torn Europe. And between 1947 and 1953, over 170,000 displaced persons came to Australia. In exchange for refuge in Australia, displaced persons, or DPs as they were known, had to enter into a work contract with the government for 2 years as unskilled labourers or domestics. So at this time, migrants were often called new Australians. In 1947, we saw an Egyptian registered ship dock in Melbourne, which brought 624 men, women and children from 26 different countries. And this sort of stirred up lots of fears amongst white Australians, fears that the future of white Australia was threatened by the arrival of many Jews and dark-skinned Southern Europeans. But migrants nonetheless played a pivotal role in the industrial redevelopment of post-war Australia at that time. So after World War II, the government believed that only industrial development could provide a sufficient economy for Australia to avoid future depressions and to compete in the world market. So, for example, in 1945, the Immigration Minister, Arthur Calwell, who we saw before, cuddling children, said that you can only understand the immigration program by giving it its proper setting in the whole national economy. So it's seen as absolutely key to Australia's economic development. He argued that even if there were no urgent security reason for our immigration, there would be sound economic ones. A great industrial expansion has taken place during and since World War II, and we as a consequence have unused industrial capacity, which offers a prosperous life to huge numbers of additional workers. So we saw a real switch from migration being about filling up an empty land to it being about stimulating the economy. And migrants were very much seen as workers. So in exchange for refuge and assisted migration passage, many of the migrants who came at this time had to work on a 2-year contract in a job directed by the government. So there was little attention paid to the skills that they already had when they arrived, and they were mainly doing what's called 3D work, which was dirty, dangerous and difficult. So one of the important things in projects that migrants worked on at that time was called the Snowy Mountains Hydroelectric Scheme, which was a huge scheme that provided electricity for New South Wales and Victoria, as well as irrigation water, and that employed over 100,000 workers from 30 different countries over 25 years. And you may have even heard their government has recently been talking about sort of bringing back the Snowy Electric Scheme as another way to provide electricity at the moment. So despite all this migration, Arthur Calwell, the Migration Minister, remained a firm believer in white Australia. And it was not by any means an open door policy when it came to immigration. So in 1948, they passed what was called the Aliens Act, which emphasised who would and who wouldn't be welcome here, with Calwell emphasising that non-Europeans, by which he meant Asians, were not desirable types, and they needed to be registered and recorded. And we then saw actual deportations in the late 1940s when Calwell took a hard line on one particular group of non-Europeans who were already in Australia, Asian migrants largely from Indonesia and Malaysia, and many of these were deported at that time. So all this time really from Federation until the sort of late 50s to mid-1960s, we had this white Australia policy. But we gradually did see changes. By the mid-1950s, for example, there were clear signs that British Australia envisaged by the nation's founders was being diluted. And there were the Colombo Plan in 1950, which allowed students from Asia to study in Australian universities. In 1957, for the first time, non-Europeans were able to become citizens if they'd been resident in Australia for at least 15 years. In 1958, they finally abolished the dictation test, which had been used to keep people out. In 1958, we saw a small number of distinguished and highly qualified Asians were allowed to migrate. 1959, Australians were allowed to sponsor Asian spouses, so people to marry. And in 1963, we saw unassisted migration was no longer restricted to certain nationalities. And so we saw a real change over those sort of 10, 15 years. In 1964, there were further relaxation of rules around people of what was called mixed descent. And finally, we saw the end of the White Australia policy in 1972, when it was decided that all future decisions about the admission of migrants to Australia would be made without, not on the basis of race, ethnicity or cultural background. So some of the reasons why these racial restrictions ended at that time was that we'd already seen the transformation of Australia since World War II through mass migration. So Australia had changed, so they sort of changed the laws to suit. There was a growing awareness throughout the 1960s about a variety of social issues. Australia's racist immigration policy was increasingly embarrassing for Australia. Governments in the 1960s had already amended legislation creating categories under which some non-whites could migrate. And Australia now wanted to trade with Asia, and this was difficult with a racist anti-Asian immigration policy in place. So this really brought in our next important stage, where Australia was explicitly started to see itself as a multicultural country. So it went directly from seeing itself as only white to seeing itself as multicultural. Multiculturalism can be thought of as a social ideal of Australia, as a mosaic of cultures within a family of nations. And there were a series of programs brought in to promote multiculturalism and bring about social justice. So at first, the term multiculturalism first emerged in an official capacity in Canada after the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism there in the mid-1960s, and then it spread to Australia very soon afterwards. So we'd had this, I guess, legal end to the White Australia policy in the early 1970s, but it was really with the arrival of large numbers of Vietnamese refugees in the later 1970s that we can perhaps consider to be the real end of White Australia. It began in 1975 and went to 1985 and was followed by family reunion, so then we had a sort of second wave of Vietnamese migration after that as well. But there was again, you know, lots of I guess some resistance. So we had, you know, articles like that one in the newspaper talking about, is it the yellow peril again? So before 1975, there were a little more than 2,000 Vietnamese in Australia. And the first people arrived on first Vietnamese refugees arrived on boats in 1976. And in 1977, the government responded with new policy initiatives. And Australia eventually took more than 112,000 refugees from Vietnam and almost 190,000 from Indonesia in the next 20 years. So this really significantly changed Australia's population. But this did bring about a whole series of Asian immigration debates, where we saw there was actually one, a professor of history at this university, Geoffrey Blaney, who's in that bottom one. He was at the forefront of questioning the government's policy, allowing so many people from Asia to come into Australia, and he was attacked as being racist for some of his comments. And that was a cartoon at the time which said, "Next, we need one highly qualified apolitical non-refugee, naturalisation, keen spot welder and microsurgeon, workaholic with ruck rover experience, prepared to change on the half forward flank." So this is sort of making fun of Australia's desire to bring in exactly the right people. So we saw new immigration trends from the 1980s into the 1990s with a greater emphasis on economics, business and skilled migration. And this grew to replace family reunion as the largest category by the mid-late 1990s. In the early 1990s, we had a Labor Prime Minister, Paul Keating, who was seen as being very pro-Asia. He wanted Australia to become a republic, so he wanted to cut some of Australia's ties to Great Britain, and he was pro-productivity. So he argued that Australia is where our future substantially lies. We can and must go there. This course we are on is irreversible, and so he was really sort of keen to see Australia focusing less on being linked to Britain and more on being part of Asia. That very much changed under our next Prime Minister, John Howard, who talked about one Australia, one nation and one future. He was Prime Minister for a long time, for 11 years, 1996 to 2007. And he really sort of was against a lot of the ideals of multiculturalism. So some of the things he said, when you come to this country, you become Australian. The objection I have to multiculturalism is that multiculturalism is in effect saying that it's impossible to have an Australian ethos, that it is impossible to have a common Australian culture. So we have to pretend that we are a federation of cultures and that we've got a bit from every part of the world. I think that's hopeless. So he was really about, I think he was often seen as idealising Australia of the 1950s, of wanting to go back to what it was like then. And he brought in this backlash against multiculturalism. Since the late 1990s, and particularly in more recent years, we've also seen a real change of Australia's migration from being mostly about permanent migration, or at least semi-permanent migration, to a lot of more temporary migration. So a lot of people coming in on temporary work visas. And that's been a real feature of, I guess, from the late 1990s up until now, really. But that's also been quite controversial. So we've seen a real sort of workers here have seen these new temporary visas, or 457 visas they're called, as being about bringing in cheap labour to undercut local pay rates and put locals out of work. Okay, so of course we also have Australia's humanitarian program, which we've had a lot of recent laws, I guess, restricting the way people who've come from refugee backgrounds can come to Australia, and there's some of the key things that have happened in that slide there. I guess one of the things that people think about in the future is the effects of migration, of climate change will have on migration, and there are predictions that we will see, a lot more people having to leave their countries because of climate change. So I'm going to stop there. We'll take a break and have some food, and then we'll come back and have our small group discussions. Thank you.